Blood spatters across the elder stone like prophecy, Isolde's palm pressed to the scarred rock, moonlight slicing her knuckles into silver. She tastes iron and the old promise where her mother carved law into bone. Around them, the pack's gathered breath is a low animal tide, waiting. The matriarch's voice is a blade. No one is strong enough to marry my lycan daughter. Isolde feels the words land as pain and reprieve at once, a fence built around a heart that has spent 12 years learning how to beat within it. The matriarch expects obedience. The pack expects obedience. Isolde expects to obey. Until the man in the back of the clearing stands, and the air shifts as if some other world has crossed the ridge. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. The last thing Isolde wanted that night was attention. The edict had been her mother's ceremonial poison, an announcement meant to crown fear as law and seal the girl into a destiny of strength no tenderness could touch. She had practiced the look, cool, impenetrable. She had practiced the silence, shoulders squared, mouth locked against the small, traitorous hum that lived in her chest whenever other hands reached for warmth. Yet when the slim figure of Elias walked forward on human feet, no leather armor, no pack sigil, only a threadbare coat and the narrow, dangerous steadiness of someone who had survived without armor by wit and stubbornness, she felt something unclenched inside her that had not been unclenched since childhood. Lysandra Vale, matriarch of the Northreach pack, had a voice like gravel and a face like winter. Scar tissue looped from temple to jaw, a map of a life wired to the old pacts. She had called the alphas from 3 territories to the Hollow, to witness, to swear, to remind everyone that bloodlines were fences and wolves did not wed with the earth tide. Her declaration had been final. Her reasoning was older than names. The hex that burned at Isolde's throat under each full moon was not merely superstition, but an omen. Witch's ink, a runic pattern that flared into veins of light. No witch, Lysandra said, had been able to lift it. No alpha line could risk its contagion. Only a shifter of equal strain could anchor Isolde. Only a union of equal to equal could hold the curse in balance. So, when Elias, human and unclaimed, stepped into that ring of opinion and law, his presence was an affront that drew a snarl from the beta at Lysandra's side and derision from the visiting alphas. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had learned fear's anatomy and refused its power over him. His hands, calloused, stained with the ink of books, were folded, not in supplication, but in a kind of vow. He made his voice small so the words would not break. I will bind myself in blood to Isolde. I will stand when the moon takes her. There was laughter at first, a ripple of it, then a tidal repudiation. The pack's humor was an old muscle. Some of the younger alphas barked, hooting at the image of a human tethering himself to a lycan woman. Others, older and more practiced in leverage, smiled the way predators do at the sight of a lamb offering itself. Lysandra's face changed. That gravel turned to ice. "You would gamble the safety of my lineage on a human whim?" she asked, each word a threat uncloaked. Elias did not flinch. He moved closer, the stones crunching under his boots. And when he reached the matriarch's shadowed space, he put his palms on the ground, mirroring Isolde, and the clearing quieted to the sound of 2 breaths measured against a rule that had stood for generations. Isolde had watched the world hold its breath over her for years, over the blood mark that lit like a secret lantern in moonlight, over the ferocity the elders taught her as if it were armor instead of isolation. They'd given her lessons in claw and howl and how to place teeth for intimidation. They'd sent her to hunt under the teenager's eyes until she learned the joy of the kill and to swallow the guilt. But no one had taught her how to accept someone who would not shrink from her when she split open beneath a full moon, and no one had told her what it would feel like to prefer a human's frailty to the unbroken ancestral steel of her mother's world. Elias's offer was not defiant bluster. It was quietly, recklessly intimate. He spoke of anchors and vows as though they were household things, ties one used to fix a door against storm or to tie a child to a mother's hip. He offered a life of small, domestic resistances against the word strong that Lysandra had made synonymous with survival. The pack's elders who had come to witness centuries of law would have called it madness. The matriarch called it treason. Isolde's breath knocked against the earth in a rhythm that surprised her. The mark on her throat throbbed, not yet flaring, but present like an incandescent question. The witches had always said the mark responded to emotional extremes. Fear steeped it in shadow. Grief widened it like an ink blot. No scholar, no coven they'd summoned had made it fade. Perhaps it answered only to courage unorthodox enough to be called folly. Perhaps it answered only to a human hand with no pedigree of rulership. She felt, for the first time, the ache of a longing that was neither hunger nor hatred, but a hunger for being cradled through transformation rather than being sharpened into weaponry. The pack's laughter condensed into plotting, and the visiting alpha's smiles sharpened into teeth-bared interest. Scandal hung over the hollow like a storm cloud ready to break. If a human could muscle into their law, what precedent did that make? If Elias succeeded, could other packs be tempted into humiliating marriages that would dilute blood strength and empower outsiders? Lysandra's rule was not merely about controlling her daughter's fate. It was about preserving a fragile equation of powers in a world where vampires kept ledger books of debts and witches priced favors with moonlight. To let a human in meant opening doors the elder world had meticulously barred. Elias, for all his unadorned ordinary looks, carried something else. He smelled of old paper and ink and a faint trace of time because he had worked his life in a shop in town where he mended the pages of other people's histories and traded in bargains whispered between covers. He was known, in a small human way, to the women who bought his books and the children who stole his spare bookmarks. What nobody in the clearing knew was why he had offered himself. Not for glory. Elias's hands were too scarred to be fighting glory's proof. Not for land. He had no claim and laughed at the idea of ownership. He had a secret tie that did not belong in the pack's circle. Years ago, he had sealed a blooded pact with a coven of witches and a minor vampire clan to save his sister's life. He had taken on the pack's weight like a man who took on another's debt, and the payment still hummed in the back of him like an unpaid bell. Isolde watched him and felt two possible futures blink into focus. One in which Lysandra's decree held and she married an equal, some fear-built alpha who could match her fury and take the curse as badge and burden. Another where Elias's fragility was a hinge on which she learned to stop being fortress. Each path had thorns. The alpha's path meant acceptance and continued isolation in the armor of family pride. Elias' path meant exposure to predators that did not respect pack lines and to old bargains that might one day come collect. "What does a bookseller know of binding?" demanded a visiting alpha, heavy-set, tattooed with sigils of conquest. His voice carried all the certitude of one who never lost. Elias, unfazed, reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a slip of paper, an old scrap with inked sigils that looked for all the world like a butcher's list and a lover's poem at once. "I know how to read covenants," he said. "I know how to keep promises." The matriarch's eyes narrowed. Lysandra had been forged in a different school. sieges and treaties, and the blood of other packs on her hands. Strength, to her, meant unbending enforcement of law. She had watched the pack survive because fear kept the teeth sharp and the jaws closed. To her, Elias was a man play-acting bravery. She could not see the life-worn courage in the plainness of his coat. She could not predict whether his human heart would hold beneath the lunar assault, or whether the vampiric coven to which he once owed something would come to fetch its due. Elder Halv, one of Lysandra's council, smelled war in the gesture. "If this is a ploy," he said, voice like old wool, "we will be conquered from within. If it is a genuine offer, we set a danger no law book can expunge." Around them, whispers coiled. The notion of testing Elias became immediate. Rituals at the moor's edge, oaths to be signed with teeth and blood, scrutiny that would pick at every seam of his past. Isolde turned away from the council's whispering to face the hollow. The moon had risen like a coin of old gods, clean and white. It would visit her in 3 cycles. The pack's law would not hesitate to enact measures, trials of endurance, of bloodletting, of public vows. But for the first time since her mother's decree, she felt a choice, raw and sharp as a newly flensed bone. The idea that someone might stand with her, not because they were her equal in ferocity, but because they would not flee when the beast in her rose, this idea burned away the icing of training her mother had applied on her spirit. Elias's presence in the hollow was like a small heat under winter's ash. It promised thaw, and it promised risk. The matriarch's jaw tightened. She could smell the future in the air. Possible alliances, possible ruination. Beyond the clearing, unseen, a vampire observed the spectacle with the detached hunger of predators accustomed to bargains and table manners. Somewhere in the town beyond the ridge, a witch turned a page and blinked at a line of ink she had not expected. Somewhere else, a pack from the south waited with claws sharpened, watching Northreach's slackness with teeth. The first act would be trials, Lysandra decided. The hollow would become an arena where vows and verdicts were sampled, where Elias's frailty would be exposed under torches and runes. The pack would test the human the way a smith tests an unproven blade, by hammer, by fire, by cold. If he failed, the price would be exile or worse. If he survived, the whole of their world would have to reconsider the old arithmetic of power. Isolde felt both terror and a strange, tender exhilaration. She had been trained to be ferocious, to hide the ache of wanting tenderness. Suddenly, offered choice, her hands shook, not in fear, but in anticipation. Outside the circle, the wind arranged itself into low, uncertain music. Somewhere deep in the pack's bones, Lysandra's decree quivered. In the hollow, the first ember of defiance glowed, small, foolish, impossible. What if the human could anchor her? What if love, not lineage, could rewrite an ancient curse? They set the trials the way one sets a wound to see if it festers. Deliberate, clinical, and public. The first was ritual, old as the pack and intended to peel truth from bones. At dawn, a week later, the hollow was ringed with faces that had known Isolde since the first howl had pushed through her baby lungs. Old mothers with eyes like riverstones, boys who still smelled of puberty and prey, visiting alphas who had come to gloat or to bargain. Torches stitched light into the fog. The earth smelled of peat and of iron. When Elias came, he carried nothing but the scrap of parchment in his fist and a linen bandage he had wrapped heedless fingers in the night before. When he knelt to sign his name, a line shaky and imperfect, the ink bled like a confession. They began with endurance. A bind of ropes that tasted of oak and old prayers entangled Elias and Isolde back to back. Lysandra intoned the words of unbreakable promise in the old guttural tongue, and the pack watched for tremors. Did the human flinch when the lycan's muscles tightened in reflex? Did the human's heartbeat quicken beyond controllable pace? The ropes were a cordon to the moon, an anchor to test if Elias could be the fulcrum. Isolde felt the rope bite into her skin and clung to the sensation, because it was real, because it was a chain she had not forged herself. Elias didn't flinch. He inhaled the air as though reading it, measuring sulfur, measuring the ghost of lavender someone had left from a charm. Then he exhaled and let the world come to him. He did not try to match the raw strength that Isolde carried in her bones. He did not attempt to lift her weight or show himself a mirror of her power. Instead, he murmured stories, flat, human things he had collected in the bookshop. A girl who mended shoes for a living and kept a secret ledger of poems. An old woman who whispered to jars of figs. Nobody in the pack would have thought them courage, and yet Isolde felt the words like a hand cupping the small of her back. The pack hissed. Half of them thought it an insult that his counter to a test of might was storytelling. Lysandra's face went slow with anger that could be measured. "Words will not stop the moon," she said. "They will not stop contagion." But words are a kind of marrow. They pulled Isolde in from the edge of the testing, something like a tether to the human world she had been trained to look down on. The endurance test ended with no collapse, no whimpering surrender. The ropes were released, and the pack counted this as a minor victory for Elias and a bitter irritation for Lysandra. If the human had passed, it was with a quietness that made the elders' teeth grind. The second test was public shame, an old, cruel rite where the pack's fears were fanned into accusation in the open. They asked Elias about his past, about debts, about the coven and the vampires he had bargained with. The air thickened with the metallic sting of accusation. The visiting alpha with the conquest tattoos paced like a caged boar. He snarled a list of the possible calamities. Seduction by vampire charm, witch luring into spells, the human leaking a poison into their bloodlines. Elias answered not with defiance, but with a steady, plain truth. "I did what I had to," he said. "My sister's lungs were dying, and the town's healers could not help. A witch offered a thing, life for life, coin for blood. I had no coin, and I had a tongue for bargains. I asked for my sister to live. I asked that the payment be made on we, not her. Why would witches accept such terms without binding you into service?" Elder Halv demanded. Elias's jaw tightened. They didn't. They wrote a covenant in ink and saliva. They wrote it with a charm that will require payment when a bell they named rings. The vampire clan was minor, hungry at the margins, an appendix of hunger they were not yet ashamed of. They took a promise and put it in their ledgers. That's all. Not allegiance, not control. A debt. I still sleep poorly. I still wake to the memory of my sister's breath like a tide. His voice was small, but where it came from, it was unassailable. He offered nothing for their pity. He offered only the truth of a man who had chosen what he could to buy another life. Isolde watched him, feeling something like a blade of light cut through the fog the elders had cultivated. He had not come to trade for power. He had come because he understood obligation in a way they had hoped their lineages would. That comprehension of payment, of taking responsibility for another's life, was in a way what Lysandra had been trying to instill, but the matriarch's method was iron. Elias's method was quiet. Then the third test, proximity under a conjured night. The witches, some of them old, visiting as consultants for a pack that did not fully trust their magic, wove a day into something like a night with lanterns of wax that smelled of bay and basil. They wanted to see if the mark on Isolde's throat responded to tenderness versus terror. Will it flare under kindness as it did under fear, or would it glow in the same way only when the moon stirred? Elias was placed beside Isolde. The two of them shared a fire that was not the pack's primary pyre, but a tether of ritual light. He did not attempt to seduce or to show dramatic affection. He brought a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. He fed her like someone feeding a bird. Isolde was taught to expect patronizing pity in such gestures, human hands that trembled with awe and then withdrew. Instead, Elias fed her with the same casual, steady motions he used when offering customers a way out of their own grief in the bookshop. He spoke in small, careful sentences, asking things as if he were peering at an inventory. "What do you fear?" he asked, not demanding, but curious. She wanted to say everything, to unravel all the taught endurance and spit it back at their faces. She wanted to tell how the mark had been a secret she nursed and loathed, how she had once watched a hare die under her claws and felt only a hollow pity, not victory. She wanted to say that what she feared the most was not being a weapon, but being a person without permission. Instead, she said, "I fear small things. I fear forgetting how to be soft." Elias' gaze softened in a way that made something like a bell sound in her chest. Then, "Well practiced," he said. "We practice softness." He told her about the bookshop's windows in winter, how he would place little paper cranes on the sill to make children smile, how he would read aloud to an old woman who had forgotten the taste of her own name. He spoke like someone cataloging tenderness, as if it were a verb one could cultivate. The witches watched his hands. The vampires from the margins leaned in like moths. The mark did not flare. It pulsed, a faint thrum that felt more curiosity than threat. Isolde's shoulders loosened. For the first time, she felt the possibility that the curse was not wholly a chain, but a riddle responding to the shape of the heart beside it. Nevertheless, the pack's triumph was muted. Lysandra watched with unreadable calculation. She had never believed softness could be an armor. She would not allow a human's gesture to rewrite law without paying a price. In between the tests, the push and pull tightened. Some in the hollow softened, drawn by the odd domesticity Elias promised, by the image of a human man willing to stand in the lunar shadow for a woman who could, by birthright, command fleets of wolves. Others hardened, their jaws setting like forged metal. The visiting alphas schemed to use the scandal as leverage. If Lysandra's authority faltered, they could stir dissent, demand vassalage, take land. They began private conversations wrapped in the cloak of diplomacy about alliances and sacrifices. The pack that had watched generations pass was suddenly brittle with political calculus. Rumor is a quick-bladed thing in a community that survives on secrets. It did not take long for whispers to reach the town, retellings skewed into titillation. The bookshop's windows were suddenly dangerous. Teenagers came to stand outside, hoping to see the man who would marry a wolf. Shopkeepers crossed the street to avoid Elias. Old friends who had once smiled at him now treated him as if he were a plague-bearer. He felt it. He bore it in his slow draw of breath and the way his shoulders sometimes tightened, like someone strapping on armor he couldn't quite wear. At night, he returned to the bookshop and sat among the volumes like a man in a small cathedral, surrounded by human voices he had collected and catalogued. He thought often of his sister, of the promise he had made. He took from the back of the shop a packet of old receipts, the ledger of the pact, and studied them by lamplight. The ink had faded, but the lines remained. Names, dates, the circled term that promised a bell. He tested the paper with a lighter, knowing better than to risk flame near the fragile thing. He buried his face in the printed scent of it and tried to map when the payment might come. The coven had been minor, the vampire clan even smaller then, but debts are patient things with long teeth. Isolde, for her part, found herself unlearning how to be the role her mother had honed into her. She slipped, occasionally, back into competitive stances when elders insulted Elias and then felt the shame like a hot brand. She began to practice being undone in private, letting her walls lower for minutes at a time after a hunt, in the small hours. And night after night, Elias would return to some corner of the hollow with a pot of tea boiled over a small iron kettle and hand it to her with 2 cracked cups. The tea held salt and thyme. It was human, intimately small work, a domestic chore disguised as a ritual of preservation. She learned how to drink without tasting blood first. She learned how to laugh at nonsense. Those small acts wounded her and then sewed new things into her skin. It did not keep the world from pushing back. One of the visiting alphas, a brute named Garuk who smelled of tobacco and conquest, staged an incident. He approached Isolde during a hunt under a false pretense and pressed a claim against her, made a show of trying to assert dominance. Isolde responded the way she had been trained. A flash of teeth, a sickle of motion, pain administered in perfect, practiced measure. Garuk groaned and fell, theatrically injured, and the pack splintered into accusations of brutality. Some applauded her ferocity. Others whispered that this was a demonstration, that if she could maim an alpha who sought to press his luck, then the pack was less predictable, less controllable. Garuk used his injury later, behind closed doors, to paint Elias as a threat who would unravel custom. And through it all, a scent rose on the edges of the hollow, a coppery note that suggested more than gossip. Vampires began to show up in town more often, subtle at first. A carriage with curtains too dark to be ordinary. A silvery woman buying rosewater in bulk. They smelled of linen at laundries, of old perfume and ash. They spoke in languages carved from velvet. The vampire prince, minor, opportunistic, the sort who prefers ledger books to swords, sent couriers with empty bowls of condolences. Their interest was not love. It was ledgers aligning and the thrill of a profit. A human pledged to a lycan could unsettle old economies. Vampires live on edges, and where edges blur, they lean like predators learning new pathways. All of this tightened around Isolde and Elias like a net, put up to test whether they would flounder. The couple, if the world would call them such, drew closer in the way of 2 people who are learning the geography of each other's scars. Elias was not theatrical. He did not promise to change law. He promised smallness, presence, a stool at the bookshop counter reserved for Isolde when she wanted to tuck away from the world. He promised anchor and patience. In private, he told her of the ledger's terms in more detail and how he had made himself the debtor to save a life that mattered to him. He spoke of the bell the witches had placed, as if it were an actual bell he'd bought on credit. He did not make it sound like a curse. He made it sound like a problem they would handle when it sounded. Isolde gripped his hand once in the hollow, while older wolves argued, and the air hummed with politics. Her palm in his felt like a test passed or failed by a thread. "What if your debt calls?" she asked. He turned his hand to press his thumb against the pulse at her wrist, a banal human reassurance that calmed her in a way no roar ever could. "Then, well answer," he said, "in our time. Not as law dictates, but as we have to." That defiance, unorthodox and tender, stung Lysandra. A line of authority had been offered a new kind of answer that bypassed her. She began to see Elias as not only an unacceptable suitor, but a symbol of undermining. She could not allow the idea of choice to grow without cutting it down. In whispers, she began to call for a trial by blood, an ultimatum executed on a moonlit night where old gods were expected to pick winners. She called a council of the pack elders and the visiting alphas. She would not be seen as weak. Isolde knew the stakes had moved beyond passion and into territory where law, love, and survival overlapped. The pack's appetite for certainty was ferocious. Lysandra would not bend for softness. Elias would not yield to threats of exile. And around them the world shifted like tectonic plates. Witches watching the ledger with interest, vampires smelling for openings, rival packs measuring the outcome like potential spoils. There was a tenderness now between them, a fragile architecture built from small rituals and shared silences, and beneath it pulsed a deeper danger, that the ledger Elias had signed might one day come to collect, and when it did, it would not ask permission of wolves or matriarchs. It would simply take. The question that had been humming since the first edict, what price for a love that defied law, began to sharpen its teeth. One night, after the torches in the hollow guttered and the pack had gone to their dens, Isolde found Elias hunched in the back room of his bookshop. Moonlight cut through the window in long bars, and dust danced like tiny constellations. He opened the ledger before her, the pages like linen skin. "I thought it would remain a debt I could pay with small kindnesses," he admitted. "I thought I could keep it from growing teeth." Isolde traced the faded ink with a fingertip. There was a line circled in a hand not his, a bell promised on such and such a moon. Her throat tightened. Then, "We will teach it not to eat us," she said, more fiercely than she had meant, as if force of will could keep Ledger's teeth at bay. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw, truly saw, how a human scarred by debt and choice can mirror a lycan's wounds, different, but not less. "I don't know if I can stop them," he whispered. "But I will try, and if they come, if the coven, if the vampires, then I will not ask you to stand alone." She rested her forehead against his, a ridiculous human gesture she had learned to value as sacrament. The ledger sat between them, a proof that the world's bargains had not yet decided their fate. Outside, beyond the shop, the town shifted, and the pack slept fitfully. The clock ticked toward a moon that would be unkind. The push and pull of the hollow had changed them. The pack's predictions hardened into plans. The vampires sharpened their interest. Witches turned pages and mouthed names they had not expected to encounter. And beneath all of it, Isolde and Elias built a quiet that was part defiance and part mercy, a private grammar that might sustain them through a price the world insisted on collecting. Whatever came, the pack had made its trials. The world had reacted. Blooded bargains were waking. The next pull, the one that would rend or bind, approached like tide. The ledger burned against Elias' palm as if the paper had learned to be flame. He had hoped to keep its lines private, to let only the soft light of the bookshop and the hush of late hours touch the promise he had once made. Hope is a foolish animal. The camp had teeth for rumor. The town had ears for scandal. The ledger had ink that would not remain hidden. Elder Halv produced it like a bludgeon in the council, unfurling Elias' pact as a man displays a trophy. The hollow had been hot with talk already, Lysandra's eyes narrow and ringing, visiting alphas leaning in like men expecting sport. Halv's hands were steady in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. He read selected lines aloud, the syllables picked like bones from a tray. "This is not a simple debt," he said. "It is an agreement. He binds himself to witch rights and to the vampires as guarantors. He paused, letting the hollow breathe. "A clause. Should a bell they name ring, they may claim one pledged life to fulfill the promise." Like a knife finding the old wound again, those words cut a jagged route through the clearing. Elias took the ledger back from Halv's hand with fingers that trembled, but his voice did not. "They were desperate terms," he said. "I asked to pay for my sister. I asked for—" "A mistake," Lysandra finished, the word like stone. Her face hardened into the mask the pack had known for years. The woman who had guided their teeth through famine and raids, who had chosen survival over sentiment. "You bartered with predators," she said. "You drew the attention of the courts. You made us prey." Isolde felt the floor of the world tilt under her. The phrase, "claim one pledged life," echoed in her skull like the tolling of some obscene bell. For months she had comforted herself with the small, private certainties Elias offered, a shared cup, a steady voice in the dark. Now the ledger spelled a specter that reached outward and grabbed at them both. She reached for Elias and found only the space he occupied, a living absence that trembled with words he had not yet said. "You knew this when you knelt," she demanded, voice thin enough to be broken glass. He looked at her then with the same tired compassion that had steadied her through the trials, and it cracked something open inside her. "I told you there were debts," he said. "I did not think, gods, Isolde, I did not think they would claim like wolves." "Then what did you think?" The question was an ache and a razor. That stories and bread would be enough to bury a vampiric ledger? That my mother would accept charity from you and call it law? The pack's whispers turned into the soundtrack of fracture. Some sided with Lysandra without thinking, their faith in matriarchal law a reflex as natural as breath. Others, younger and less browned by the wind of old fights, looked at Elias with a new sympathy that bordered on disgust for their own elders. The visiting Alpha Garuk feigned outrage with theatrical flourish, his eyes meeting Elias's with the predatory gleam of one who smelled weakness and meant to use it. Elias stepped forward. "I did what I thought a man must. I bought back a life when none could otherwise be given. My sister is alive because of that debt. I would not undo it. I swore that I would hold whatever price came for as long as I lived." "Then you bind us to their accounting," Lysandra said. Her hand, scarred, authoritative, lifted to the sign of old covenant. "A bell the witch's name will ring, and a vampire will come to collect. You have placed a sword at our throat." "It is not what I would have wished," Elias replied. "But my sister lives. That is why I did it." Isolde's fingers dug into his sleeve, the cloth hot under her nails. The ledger squirmed between Halv's hands, the ink glimmering like a living map. "So you bought a life on our shoulders?" she asked. "To save your sister, you would turn us into collateral?" He closed his mouth. The ledger's threat had the blunt, inhuman patience of debt. It did not negotiate. It bided seasons and then found its time. "I would not take collateral willingly," Elias said, and his voice broke at the end, the human sound of a man who had carried a bargain alone for years. "But I have carried worse debts. You've made us prey," Lysandra cut him off, and she did not speak as a mother now, but as a ruler whose duty was to the survival of bloodlines, to fences built by ancestors who had known a world colder than this one. "For this you will be judged." The judgment that came was not swift only because Lysandra liked formalities. She called for a private hearing. The council would decide whether Elias's presence could be tolerated. Some argued exile. Some argued for the severing of the pact between the human and Isolde, so the vampiric clause could not be triggered through their union. Halv, whose eyes had long looked hungry at the thought of consolidating power beneath a matriarch who could be undermined, suggested harsher measures. If the ledger made them liable, perhaps they should offer a sacrifice to the Southern Alphas in exchange for a treaty. Questions of honor braided into political calculus. Garuk and others from the visiting packs saw leverage. "If Northreach cannot secure its own," Garuk hissed, "we should offer them vassalage." They will take our protection, and their daughters will become our wards. That possibility, expected, brutal, frayed something in Isolde that no training had been able to harden. A life as ward under Garrick's shadow would be worse than anything she feared from the moon. The matriarch's eyes flicked to her then, measuring, deciding which punishment would preserve blood and land and which would preserve Lysandra's name. For the first time, Isolde glimpsed the thing that had made her mother so iron. Choices made not for tenderness, but for survival. There was treachery in the council then, and the first crack was audible. Elder Halv, clever and patient as a sewer snake, had been negotiating with Garruk in the spaces between meetings. He sketched a plan that would force Northreach into submission in exchange for security against vampiric collection. Half the room heard his words like a threat, the other half heard like salvation. "Promise us vassalage," Halv offered to Garruk with a dissembling smile. "And in exchange, we commit to cede to you any claim that arises from this human's ledger. We will be the pack that remembers how to avoid debt." Garruk's grin showed too many teeth. "We take the land and the women," he said openly. "We maintain favor with the matriarch and ensure the ledger's claim cannot unbalance our own holdings." The plan was vulgar and efficient. To a man like Halv, whose moral compass was lubricated in the oil of survival, it was an elegant solution. To Isolde, it was betrayal incarnate. Her mother's counsel had moved with the stealth of a spider making nets. They had woven power with the intent of trapping the pack in new lines of obedience. When Isolde realized what Halv had offered, something cold and absent fell in her. It was the knowledge that the people she had trusted to protect her life had placed the ledger on a scale and weighed her future against land. She had never been allowed to be tender and also to be sovereign. The ledger had become a device that exposed who would sell her to save their teeth. She went to her mother then, not in the hollow, but to the matriarch's den, a place of hanging pelts and the scent of iron. Lysandra sat like a winter queen, the weight of leadership heavy on the shoulders she had always carried with ruthless steadiness. "You would trade me?" Isolde's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that did not ask but accused. Lysandra's eyes were devoid of the softness Isolde sometimes imagined in her when she was small and unscarred. "I will preserve this pack," she said. "If that means we must make bargains, then we will make them. You are not a person, child. You are continuity." The words landed like blows, each syllable a blade. Isolde had known her mother could be uncompromising. She had not imagined the day she would be negotiated like a field. The betrayal changed the contour of her grief. She had expected to be the one who might choose exile or love. She had not expected to learn that the women who taught ferocity in her bones would sell the shape of her life without asking her. "I will not be traded," Isolde said simply. Her palm clenched on the doorframe until her nails stung. "I will not be a ledger entry." Lysandra's face folded, and for a barely held breath there was the slightest flicker of the mother she had been, a woman who had held a crying infant and soothed it with the back of her hand. It vanished as quickly. "You will not force me to choose between you and this pack," Lysandra said. "Not if my name drips into the dirt. I married for the pack to live." Betrayal had many faces. This one was clinical and stately. News of the proposed vassalage leaked like oil into water. Half the pack balked, their loyalties splitting along lines older than memory. The rest, terrified by the ledger's threat and the possibility of vampiric retribution, nodded to Half's plan. Garruk rubbed his hands together like a man counting coins. Elias, when he heard the offer to turn Isolde into a bargaining chip, felt something ugly and merciless surface in him. He had never wished violence. His life had been a narrow path between debts and kindness. But the thought of what Halv and Garuk proposed, of the woman he had come to love being reduced to a political asset, scalded him. He went to Halv with the ledger clutched in his hands, a mad hope for reason. "You cannot do this," he said. "You cannot." "You made this," Halv replied, gentle only as someone handling a dangerous animal. "Your bargain has consequences." The southern alphas began to move in the peripheries then, making offers, smelling weakness like blood. Vampire couriers, sleek and implacable, began to appear in places they did not belong, at the market, under the guise of merchants, in taverns, as patrons who preferred corners and watched without blinking. The Coven's witches, who had once touched Elias' ledger with a furrowed interest, whispered in alleyways with a tone of counting. The bell the Covenant spoke of was no myth. The right conditions might make it ring. And then the first violence occurred. Garuk, in a show of strength, executed a midnight seizure of Elias' sister, an old vendetta disguised as leverage. It was meant as a bite that would force Elias to surrender, to lure him into bargaining like the man he had once been. Garuk's men took the sister as a pawn and left word that the ledger would be honored unless Elias turned himself in and agreed to a public severing of his bond to Isolde. Elias did not bargain. He did not yield. He moved like a man who had already made too many choices for other people's safety. He freed his sister in a night that became a scrawl of blood and rage. And in the wake of that rescue, the vampires took notice, not to claim him, but to test what resistance looked like. The ledger had teeth, and now it sniffed the hem of violence. The hollow erupted into factional rage. Some called for the immediate exile of Elias to avoid further bloodshed. Others demanded that Lysandra cut a deal with Garuk to return the sister in exchange for peace. Halv, his machinations showing, pushed for the vassalage as the only practical path. Isolde watched the pack unspool, each thread tugged by interest and fear. Her mother argued logistics and law. Halv whispered alliances. Garuk grinned with an ugly satisfaction. In the center of the storm, Elias bore his choices like a man who understood the cost of each one. He had not asked to become a lightning rod for the pack's hungers, and yet he stood under the weather like a man who would not run. The fracture tore at the seams of more than law. It unraveled the intimate things that had started to knit between Isolde and Elias. Suspicion crept like mold. Had he brought this danger? Had his depths made them prey? Had she, by daring to choose tenderness over lineage, invited ruin? On a low, iron night, the pack voted to detain Elias until a proper settlement could be made. They argued they were protecting Isolde. Elias understood it as punishment for loving her. Halv's plan to hand over vassalage to Garuk was tabled, too risky a public move, but whispers of trading power for peace made their way into the dens. Isolde found him in the holding pit, hands bloodied from his last rescue, eyes rimmed with fatigue. He did not rage. He held her gaze with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown in trials. "I did not ask for this," he said, "but I will not run." She pressed her forehead to his through the bars. "I did not think choosing you would mean you'd have to fight for your life," she whispered. "I did not think my mother would choose politics over me." Elias's hand found hers through the iron. "Then choose now," he said. "Choose what you will be. The ledger will not wait until the pack has made peace with their conscience." Outside, the hollow hummed with talk. Wolves paced ancient circles of suspicion. Vampires sipped their long night patience and watched the ledger's edges for the right moment to strike. Witches muttered about contracts and loopholes as if cataloging a harvest. The fissures in the pack were no longer subtle. They ran like creeks through everything, through mother and daughter, through old friendships, through the very law Lysandra had built her life upon. Isolde left the pit that night with the taste of iron in her mouth. She had a choice: to bow to a matriarch who would barter her for security, or to break with the pack she loved for the man who had, by all accounts, complicated every balance she understood. Her heart felt like a thing split in two, the halves still beating but not yet rejoined. The ledger lay between them, inked, patient, waiting. The bell it promised would ring on a moon that had not yet come. But actions could make the bell sound early. Choices would turn whispers into war. Isolde paced the cliff above the hollow, the wind whipping her hair into an unruly halo. Below, the pack argued, its voices carried thin and distant. The town beyond stirred with the small joys of living, oblivious and therefore guilty. In her hand, Elias's palm was a warm thing, stubborn and human. Around her neck, the blood mark pulsed like a heartbeat under the skin, not yet lit by the moon, but aware of the coming. She could feel the fracture in the air now as something that had teeth. It would take one wrong move, one handshake in the dark, one ledger signed by fear, to make the bell toll. She thought of her mother's face, of the old laws that had kept them alive, of Garruk's grin, of Halv's patient calculations. She thought of Elias's sister and the taste of rescue on her tongue. And beneath all of that, she felt the small, impossible treble of her own desire to be loved in a world that measured worth by bite and dominance. The fracture would either break them or make a new shape entirely. Isolde breathed in the salt and peat and iron of her world, and, for the first time, allowed herself to answer not in reflex, but in the quieter language of choosing. Below, in the hollow, men argued as if fate were a negotiable thing. Above, two hearts considered whether to meet the bell with armor or with hands unarmed. And the moon watched, patient as always, ready to be the final witness to whatever came next. They came for her in the hour when the hollow's arguments still rattled like chains, and the town's lamps had not yet surrendered to the moon. A dozen men, Garruks, moved with the ease of those who think the world owes them obedience. They did not call it an abduction. They called it a precautionary relocation, a bargaining chip to be kept in a warm cage. They came with rope and the clumsy grace of entitlement. Isolde met them on the path before they could cross the throat of the hollow. She could have torn them. She had been trained to rend a man with the economy of a blade. She chose instead the thing that had become her new muscle, a stillness learned in kitchen light and bookshop stories. She stood with Elias's memory hot at the place where his palm fit hers, and let the pack's heat gather behind her, a slow thunder. Garruk's men laughed until one of them, a young, dough-faced thing, saw the steel in Isolde's eyes and stepped back. It was not mercy. It was the small terror that a wolf can show when it knows the line between appetite and doom. Garruk himself came forward, scenting display and expecting little but spectacle. He wanted to force a reaction, to make Isolde howl and show the pack what it meant to be unruly. Instead, she reached into her coat and drew out the ledger, the very paper Halv had waved like a weapon, and held it against Garruk's chest with both hands. The pages fluttered like a bird trying to escape. "You will not turn me into your pawn," she said, voice low and so controlled it brushed them like cold. The ledger's ink glinted in the torchlight, a challenge. Garak laughed, then belted the way a man who believes in theater does, and reached to take it from her. His fingers closed on the paper, and it was like touching a live thing. The ink burned with the memory of promises. Before Garak could tear it from her, a shadow moved at the edge of the hollow. Quick, lithe, not wolf nor entirely human. Elias stepped into the torchlight like a man who had been to the bottom of something and decided to surface for air. His face was streaked with bruises from the rescue of his sister. His hands smelled of blood and binding cord. He did not run toward Isolde like a man reckless in love. He came like a man who had decided the price and would pay it willingly. "You made a ledger a weapon," Elias said to Garak, and his voice carried the quiet damage of a man who had carried debts and now carried fury. "You will not use it to sell a life." Garak swept an arm toward him. "You are detained," he growled. "Your bargains have made us vulnerable. Hand over the ledger and we may." The world tightened. Halv, hiding behind a careful neutrality his whole life, stepped into the torchlight with the thin smile of a man who had brokered too many destinies. "We can secure trade," he said. "We can arrange." Isolde did the only thing that felt like an honest salvation. She put the ledger into Elias's hands and, without a shout, kissed him. Not the small ceremonial pressures the pack might have expected, but a feral, claiming mouth that tasted like smoke and iron and promise. The kiss was a binding in itself, a public sacrifice, a private oath. Around them, the pack inhaled as one body. "I will not be traded," she said when the kiss broke, breathless and raw. "And neither will the man I choose." Elias's eyes were a storm. He could have taken her and run, could have offered his life sole and final. He held the ledger with a decision like a blade. "If they take me," he said, voice steady, "they will have to take me whole. They will not use you as collateral." Garak laughed, and in his laugh was the calculation of those who would use death as bargaining. He lunged. The first blow was a mess of fury. The hollow erupted into violence that smelled of old law and newer treachery. Wolves answered with teeth. Garak's men thought themselves ready to fight wolves. They were not ready for a pack defending a daughter who had chosen. The skirmish was loud and fast, a flaring of limbs and lamp oil and oath-sung profanity. In the tumble, Elias moved like a single, dangerous thing. He clutched the ledger to his chest and shoved Garak back, a human body against alpha strength, absurd and terrifying. Halv raised a knife to end the farce. For a moment, every threat gathered on a single seam. The ledger, the kiss, the pack's loyalty, and the hunger of the men who wanted governance over other people's fates. Something older and stranger answered then. From the rim of the hollow, a slow, rasping sound came not from wolf throats, but from the town's shadowed lanes. Night creatures, drawn by the scent of bargaining. Vampires, those ledger-hungry predators, arrived like winter. They did not need invitation. They thrived where blood met promise. Their prince, sleek in a way that undercuts violence with politeness, stepped forward, eyes bright as coin. "You have given us entertainment," he said, voice velvet, and in it was a bargain hunter's amusement. "You have a ledger with our ink." Isolde stepped forward before her mother could marshal the pack's anger. She had been trained to bow to law. She had instead learned how to ask for mercy and make it look like a command. "Take me instead," she offered, and her words stopped the hollow like a bell. "Take my life as payment for his debt." For a breath, the world held. Lysandra's face cratered into something like grief and a ruler's calculation. Halv's mouth twitched. The vampire prince smiled widened in interest. He had expected teeth, but this was theater. Blood offered freely was rarer than coercion.
"No," Elias said, as if he had not thought of it but had carried its answer in him all along. "You take me, not her." The choice laid itself large and awful. He stepped forward, a man between a woman who had offered herself and the hunger that measured lives in coin. He whispered something to Isolde, an apology, a prayer, a promise, and the pack's howl rose like surf. Lysandra moved, finally, with a speed bred by years of deciding between survival and sentiment. She put between Elias and the velvet hunger the full weight of her rule and her love, an iron gift and a mother's claim, barking terms with a ferocity that startled even the ancient vampire. "No bargain leaves this pack unless I sanction it," she demanded, voice breaking both law and heart. "If a life is taken, it will be a life of my choosing." In that moment, the old and the new collided. Elias's sacrifice was offered like a blade. Lysandra's matriarchal hunger wrapped it in law. Pride and love tangled. The vampire prince smelled advantage and, with serpentine courtesy, proposed a trade. The ledger's claim would be honored if the matriarch herself agreed to a season-long bond of hospitality and tribute. It was a thin mercy, a legalese wrapping a leash. Lysandra's eyes found her daughter. For the first time in years, the matriarch's voice shook with a mother's rawness. "I will not let my child be used," she said. It was an admission of weakness and an axe blow to her old self. Then she did something that no one there had predicted. She offered herself as guarantor. "I will bind myself to this ledger," Lysandra said, "before any of you make a bargain of my daughter." She stepped to Elias and placed her scarred hand on the ledger, the ancient sign of covenant pressed into ink and paper. The pack, astonished, quieted. It was a sacrifice and a claim. The matriarch bound her authority, her pack, and her name to the protection of the man who had dared stand. In doing so, she severed the right of any alpha to use Isolde as currency. The vampire prince, always a ledger watcher, weighed the cost in his eyes. A pack's matriarch on a pledge was more valuable than a single human's life. He nodded, calculating. It was not ideal, but the world turned on compromises. Elias, who had come to be the hinge for a new kind of future, relaxed as if the knot around his ribs had been cut. He would still be accountable to his covenant, to the witches he had bargained with, to whatever bell might ring. But Lysandra's public guarantee redirected the compass of that debt. Vampires loved leverage. A matriarch's warning made some paths less profitable. Garruk stepped back, seeing the tide had turned and his wager lost. They made terms in the hollow like bedrock being relaid. The vampire prince demanded a season's tribute, and Lysandra offered it. Not her daughter, not her sovereignty, but a compromise that would preserve the pack's continuity and refuse the commodification of its people. Halv, affronted that his maneuver had been outmatched, seethed but could not immediately counteract the matriarch's public sacrifice. The pack howled, not in celebration, but in the long relief of a wound that had been staunched by an unexpected hand. In the aftermath, Isolde and Elias stood close enough that their breaths braided. The ledger lay between them, dented and paradoxically quieter for having been the focal point of so many hearts. Elias looked at Lysandra with a gratitude that had edges neither polite nor humble. Isolde, whose whole life had been an education in being weapons, let herself be held by a man who had chosen to be shield. Lysandra's voice, when it came, was small and raw. "You wanted tenderness and found war," she told her daughter. "You wanted a choice. You have made me a fool, and yet you have forced me to be better." Isolde laughed, a short, incredulous sound that felt like thawing. "You forced yourself," she corrected. "You have always been iron. Tonight, you melted."
Elias took both their hands, his to Isolde's warm and wild, then to Lysandra's scarred and authoritative. And in that small clasp a new covenant hummed, one not inked by witches alone, nor by ancestral law alone, but by a mother's sacrifice, a human's risk, and a daughter's refusal to be traded. The vampire prince, satisfied with terms and smelling fewer profits, receded with his court, leaving the hollow to lick its wounds and adjust its thinking. They had not ended the debts. The ledger remained, a patient thing. Rewards and penalties still stalked the margins. Vampires would not forget the ink. Witches would keep their clauses. But for that night, a new alignment had been minted. Lysandra had chosen the pack in the only way that mattered. She had chosen to bind herself to its people rather than sell them as tokens. Elias, bruised and suddenly unmoored, leaned his forehead against Isolde's and let the tremor of the world settle. "I would have given myself," he said simply. "You did," she replied. "You gave us a choice." They did not walk away unscarred. Garuk nursed his pride into a new vendetta. Halves schemed beneath layers of civility. The coven turned pages and weighed loopholes. The bell's eventual toll still hung like a fact on the horizon. But in the hollow that night, under the white watching moon, a matriarch had sacrificed her reputation to save her daughter, and a human had forced elders to question what strength meant. When the dawn found them, Isolde and Elias sat at the small bookshop's single wooden table, cups of tea steaming between them. Her mark along her throat felt like a quiet animal, soothed by touch and steady presence. He folded the ledger into a box and locked it behind him, not out of cowardice, but because some things must be contained until the right tools are at hand. Their hands met over the table, rough and soft fingers braided. They had won not by violence alone, but by the most dangerous kind of weapon, the offer to sacrifice oneself on another's behalf. It had reshaped the pack's law in a way no decree could, because it had replaced a bargaining token with a living heart. Outside, the world waited, the witches poised to bargain, the vampires to tally, the other packs to watch and learn. But inside the bookshop, amid dust and paper and the smell of tea, two people who had been made dangerous by love leaned into each other and chose fiercely and tenderly to keep standing. Dawn unspooled itself in a hush of watercolor over the town, and with it came a quieter reckoning. The pack did not instantly unlearn its old math. There were meetings and thin smiles and alliances reborn into new shapes. Garuk slunk away to nurse grudges that would fold into later storms. Halv retreated to weave subtler schemes. The coven and the vampiric ledgers kept their teeth for another season. But the ledger that had been a threat became, by the matriarch's sacrifice and by Elias's stubborn steadiness, a ledger tempered by human valence and wolf-bred law. Isolde found the bareness she had been taught, how to be useful, how to be fierce, softened by a new grammar of choice. She walked the hollow in the mornings, not as an exhibit of maid strength, but as someone who had been given room to be whole. Wolves that had once flanked her as instruments of rule now padded quietly at her heels like companions rather than props. Children began to bring small offerings to the bookshop: a crooked bookmark, a feather, a baked currant bun. They watched Elias with the curious reverence of those who had seen someone weather a storm without crumbling. Lysandra's change was slow and complicated. She kept the rulings and the weight of command, but learned, with the rough grace of a woman who had been made to harden for survival, to ask for counsel and to listen to the word no when it came from her daughter's mouth. At night, she would sit, sometimes, where the firelight propped its shadow, and braid stories of packs she had led, tales embroidered with casualty and courage, and then fold in a memory of Elias's plain, unadorned vow. It did not make her softer in the ways the hollow had once made its preference for softness a fault. It made her less certain that iron was the only administration of care. Elias and Isolde built small rituals that became bulwarks against the ledger's patient appetite. They read to each other from battered books, epics that smelled of dust and comfort, until laughter creased Isolde's mouth in ways it had not in years. They mapped the coven's likely routes, paid informal visits to witches who were more mercenary than malevolent, and learned the particularities of vampire etiquette enough to make their presence awkward in the right rooms. They trained, Isolde in tempering her violence with precision, Elias in binding words and counterclauses into parchments that might one day be a defense rather than a confession. The work of survival, they discovered, was as domestic as it was strategic. There were nights when the mark on Isolde's throat flared with the moon, and the bookshop emptied of customers, because rumor still tasted of scandal. Elias would hold her through those moans that were half lycan, half human, humming stories until the pain folded into something softer. Other nights, the hollow called for counsel, and she would go, not as a surrendered daughter, but as a woman who had demanded to be seen whole. Each time she returned, Elias would be waiting at the door with a cup of tea, and the simplest gesture of him, his steady hand, his salt-scented breath, stitched her back to the world. They did not become mythic by defeating every predator. They became dangerous in a different register, in their refusal to be commodified, in a public tenderness that made profit-driven predators find the ledgers less tidy. The vampire prince learned what matriarchal stubbornness could do to a ledger. The witches learned that human bargains could be renegotiated when witnesses tightened the knots of covenant differently. Other packs watched, and, in private, considered whether lineage should always be armor or sometimes scaffold. On a late autumn evening, when the hollow was rimed with frost and the moon split itself across the sky like a promise, Isolde walked to the peak where she had first heard her mother's decree. Elias followed, carrying a book wrapped in brown paper and a single stubborn daisy he had saved from a market stall. She laid her palm once against the elder stone, the one that still tasted faintly of blood and law, and closed her eyes. "You kept me," she said into the wind, voice small and enormous at once. "You chose me," he answered, and there was no hierarchy in his sentence, only reciprocity. Below them, the pack settled into a new rhythm that would take generations to name, a law not only of teeth, but of promises held with human hands and matriarchal courage. Above, the moon watched them as it always had, impartial, luminous, indifferent to bargains. But something there had shifted. A bell that might someday toll would do so over a community remade by sacrifice and by the stubbornness of two people who refused to be currency. Isolde opened her eyes. The mark on her throat did not glow like a bell. It lay quiet, a living line that hummed in time with Elias's pulse beneath her fingers. She leaned into him, and for once the future was not a ledger to be feared, but a page they would write together, inked in small mercies, signed in kisses, and bound by the fierce, fragile thing that had made a matriarch soften and a ledger bend: the unexamined courage of choosing another.